After wishing everyone a good morning, we're on Daf Ayin Zion, and you'll see on the left side a Tosis Dibra Maskil Rabbi Eliezer. And if you go up just one line above that, Savruha, that's where we got up to yesterday. The Mishnah is telling us that if you have a korban which has a Zman Kavua, which means it's time sensitive, time urgent, then you're allowed to be makriv it b'tumah. And the Gemara is going to analyze this heter of bringing a Korban Tzibbur shekavul azman b'tumah and try to figure out who is the author of our Mishnah. Barua, the Gemara is going to try to attribute our Mishnah to Rabbi Yeshua, and that's based on the following premise. De kuli alma Tumah dechuya hi b'tzibur. Now, let me say by way of introduction that when we say that the Mishnah is Rabbi Yeshua, that is going to be clarified later on in this Gemara here on the bottom of Daf Ayin Zion, with regard to the sheet of Rabbi Yeshua, benim ein dam ein basar. And we'll see what that means as we go along. But first, we need another premise, and the Gemara thinks that basically all the Tanoim, with the exception of one, accepted that premise, and that's called Tumah dechuya b'tzibur. Now, if we combine these two principles, number one, Tumah dechuya b'tzibur, and number two, im ein basar ein dam, and im ein dam ein basar, once we combine those two together, we will prove that our Mishnah reflects the sheet of Rabbi Yeshua. I'm just giving you a little bit of a preview to get a little bit of an overview of what's coming around the bend. So first, we want to establish principle number one, and that is Tumah dechuya b'tzibur. And as we mentioned yesterday, it bears repetition. What that means is that we should lechatchila do everything in our power to try to avoid bringing the Korban Tzibbur. And even if it means recruiting Kohanim Tahorim from a different mishmar, if that's what it takes, that's what we have to do. So that's called Tumah dechuya b'tzibur. Now the lumdus, the conceptualization is that although the Torah says it's asur, and you're not allowed to be makriv a korban b'tumah, and in truth, even in the case of a korban tzibbur that's time urgent, you're not allowed to violate tumah and bring the korban b'tumah. But that's called dechia. Dechia means that the means justify the ends, or the other way around, the ends justify the means, which means that will allow you to actually do that which is prohibited because of the halach of dechia. And you can be docha the iser, and it really involves violating the iser. So this is not the way the Torah wants to do it. The halach of dechia means the less brera, there's not a third option, then A will override B, but B is still awesome. That's called dechuya. So, for example, if you're being mekayim an essay and violating a losasa at the same time, that's not the perfect ideal way of doing things. Try to avoid that whenever possible. If at the end of the day it becomes impossible, then essay docha losasa. But that's the law of dechia. And we have many such examples where, for example, you have two mitzvahs aseh that are both chal simultaneously. You have to make a choice. So there might be a din of dechia. But again, the din of dechia means that you may have to push off the second mitzvah in favor of the first mitzvah for whatever reason. But the second mitzvah is still hanging over your head. And whenever you get a chance, you'll have to implement the second mitzvah. That's dechia. And that's called Tumah dechuya b'tzibur. Now, the next part of the Gemara's logic is somewhat challenging, but we'll try to do the best we can. The Gemara is going to assume that if you accept Tumah Dechuya B'Tzibur, then you must have what's called Ritzui Tzitz. Why? Because the carbon is now being brought to Tumah. If I hold Dechuya, I am actually bringing a carbon B'Tumah. You can't deny that. And the Torah doesn't allow us to bring a carbon B'Tumah. So we need something, some agent that could elevate this carbon to the status of a mechaper. In other words, it could generate the validity and the kapara power of the carbon, even though it's B'Tumah. And what is that agent? That agent brings about the kapara through something called ritzui, as if to say that God will accept it, even though it's really not acceptable. So what is that agent, that catalyst that creates ritzui? That's called the tzitz. And we'll see the psukim inside in Mitzvah Hashem as to where we know from the Torah itself that the tzitz gives Hashem or effectuates a ritzui that Hashem should accept the carbon, even though it's an avera, even though it's an avon biyadenu, because we're bringing it b'tumah. That's called ritzui tzitz. So again, there's an interdependence here between two principles. Number one, tumah d'chuya, and number two, ritzui tzitz. One without the other is not going to cut the mustard. You can't have d'chuya and have the carbon achieve ritzui unless you have some sort of an agency, an agent that is engendering a ritzui on something which in itself is tameh and cannot generate a ritzui. It's an avon, and that's going to be the tzitz. So first of all, I would give you a summary in this introduction that I find here in my Gemara about the difference between hutra and dechuya. He says that, do we have to run around and try to find a way of being makar of the carbon v'tahara? Is that absolutely necessary? And he gives an example of a group of Kohanim who are in charge. That's the base of that day's worth of avoda and the Tumah. Do we have to invite the Kohanim of a different base av, or do we apply the principle of hutra, which means that we don't have to run around and find a way of bringing the carbon v'tahara? Fine. If we hold dechuya, then the principle could be summarized in the following words: Ein lidchos es hatumah ela b'makom she'efshar b'ofen acher. Okay? And therefore, yakrivu kohanim acherim, we will recruit other kohanim. Now he has another nafkamina. V'chein, if you hold tumah dechuya b'tzibur, im nitan lahakriv b'tumah kala, tzarich lahakriv b'tumah kala below b'tumah chamura. There's a hierarchy of tumos. Let's say, for example, there's a basic tumah which may be called malkeri, let's say, and then we go up to another tumah which is tumah sheretz, and then we go up to tumah's mes, and then from tumah's mes we jack it up to tumah ziva, azav, and then the most severe laws of tumah apply to a mitzorah. And you have a whole hierarchy, and if you have two options, better to choose the lower tumah, which is called a tumah kala, it's all relative, to a higher, more intense tumah, which is called the tumah chamura. That also reflects this principle called tumah dechuya b'tzibur. Now he quotes a Gemara in Masechet Yoma on Daf Zayin to the effect that when it comes to a Korban Yachid as opposed to a Korban Tzibbur, then in any situation that will be doche tumah on behalf of a korban yachid, whatever that situation is, it's always going to be tumah dechuya for a yachid, for a korban yachid. So if you have a korban yachid that is absolutely critical now, and there's no way that you could postpone it, the only way you could achieve and fulfill the obligation of that korban yachid is bitumah. Everybody agrees in that case, tumah dechuya biyachid. Our sugya of tumah, whether it's dechuya or hutra, is a Korban Tzibbur. Only in a Korban Tzibbur do we have one shita, which we'll soon see, Rabbi Yehuda, who holds Tumah Hutra B'Tzibur. But in the case of a Korban Yachid, everybody agrees Tumah Dechuya B'Tzibur. Now he has a long discussion here with the Chagas Aryeh. I'm not exactly sure if this is up my alley right now. He wants to know whether this halacha that according to the Man Yomer Tumah Hutra B'Tzibur B'Yachid it's Tumah Dechuya B'Tzibur, is that a Doraisa halacha or it's a Derabanan halacha? There's a Tosfos in Yuma Daf Zion that seems to indicate that with Doraisa there's no difference between a Korban Tzibbur and a Korban Yachid, and in a case where we're going to be Docha Tumah even for a Korban Yachid, then we're going to apply the principle on a Doraisa level of Hutra. That's what Tosfos seems to say, and the Chagas Aryeh basically rewrites the script, and he says no, that if you hold Tumah Hutra B'Tzibur, even Midoraisa, in a Korban Yachid, it's going to be Dechuya. In other words, the Doraisa halacha lowers Hutra to Dechuya from a Tzibur to a Yachid. The Yachid is only Dechuya, and that's the Doraisa halacha. Tosfos and Yuma seems to indicate that Midoraisa there's no difference between a Korban Tzibur and a Korban Yachid, and we always would apply Hutra according to Man Yomer holds Hutra, and it's only Midrabban. Okay, that's as I say, a very deep and profound discussion, where especially I just want to show you why that whole discussion comes up here in our sugya, because in a sense the Mishnah as our jumping off point here for this discussion of Hutra and Dechuya in a case of Korban Tzibbur, our Mishnah is addressing the case of a Korban Pesach. Korban Pesach is a Korban Yachid. Every individual is obligated to bring his Korban Pesach. It's not like one korban that's brought on behalf of God's Klal Yisrael. You could have a situation where all of Klal Yisrael be Yotzei with one Korban Pesach, but that works midin shlichus. But that it really means that each person individually is fulfilling his obligation vis-a-vis Korban Pesach vicariously through one korban. But it's my korban, it's your korban, it's a Korban Yachid. So that if we assume that there's an exact equation on a Doraisa level between a Korban Tzibbur and a Korban Yachid, then our Gemara makes a lot more sense, because our Gemara is really focused on our Mishnah, which is focused on Korban Pesach. And if it's a Korban Yachid, then it's a little bit odd that the Gemara is entering into the issue of Dechuya versus Hutra and a Korban Yachid. But if you accept the Chagas Aryeh, then you're gonna have to assume somehow that a Korban Pesach is really a Korban Tzibbur, and you could have a possibility on the Doraisa level of Hutra. If you go with Tosfos and Yoma, then on a Doraisa level, there's no difference between a Korban Tzibbur and a Korban Yachid. And if I hold Hutra in a Korban Tzibbur, I'll apply that same principle to a Korban Yachid. And then Korban Pesach fits like a glove here in this sunnah. Now the Chagas Aryeh has a Rashi, and Rashi seems to identify Korban Pesach as a Korban Tzibbur because it's brought by Kinufya. Kinufya meaning as a group. Masses and myriads of Jews get together and they bring the Korban Pesach, right? The Azora is overflowing, with 1.2 million Jews bringing their Korban Pesach. I don't get it. I mean, this undermines everything I've been taught by my Rebbe since I'm, I don't know how old. He always used to say that a tzibur is not just a conglomerate and a sum total of yechidim. Even if you'd have all the yechidim on the face of the earth, it still remains a yachid. Korban Tzibbur is something that goes beyond the yachid. So that to say that because the Korban Pesach is brought b'kinufya, and we all come into the Azara on that afternoon of the 14th of Nisan, that makes it into a Korban Tzibbur. That's something that must be understood. I don't know how, but it must be understood. I have no doubt that my Rebbe addressed this question. I don't have access to it. Okay. Now, let's just talk a little bit about the tzitz. He says that a tzitz is kimin tas shel zahav. It's very relatively small, but it's a flat piece of gold, right? Hammered out gold. And it has the thickness of shtei etzbos, so it's really quite thin. And it's worn al metzach hakohen gadol. Umakiv es hametzach mi ozen li ozen. Okay? That's what I wear every day when I go to shul. Anyway, but it's not made of gold. And he says, Kosiv olav, they inscribe onto this gold, Kodesh Lashem. And the Torah says, Shmos Chavches, V'hoyal Metzach Aaron, V'nosra Aaron es avona kadoshim, asher yakdishu b'nei Yisrael, etc., etc. And then it says, V'hoyal Mitzchot Tamid, L'ratzon Lahem Lifnei Hashem. But the key words here in this pasuk for our purposes, V'nosa Aaron es avona kadoshim. As if to say that Aaron is somehow atoning for Avon, but what kind of Avon? Avon HaKadosh. And Rashi already points out in his commentary on the Torah that V'nosan is a lashon of kapara, right? Nesius Avon means to be mechaper for someone's sin, and the sin of the kodshim refers to a korban that was brought to Tumah, or meaning the kohanim with tmeim, etc. So avon sha'olav mechaper atzitz hu hakrova b'tumah, and the tzitz is meant to be mechaper, which in this context means to generate a power of kapara in the korban, which is called ritzui, for tumah. And all this reflects the concept called Tumah Dechuya. And if it's Dechuya, you've got Avona Kadosh. And if I need the tzitz, because V'nosas Avona Kadosh. He says that Lashon Neratzos, when we speak about Ritzui tzitz, Hainu Sheniskaper Ha'avon Shel Hakrova B'tumah, the Ola HaKarban L'ratzon Lifnei Hashem. That's what we call Ritzui Karban. And this is effectuated in the case of Tumah by the tzitz. Okay, now let's add one other important point to the equation. The Gemara says that Tumah dechuya b'tzibur, and therefore boy tzitz l'ratzos. Now this is a little bit of a gap. There's a logical gap that we have to jump over here, an equation. Why? Because when we say tzitz is maratz al tumah, that means b'di'evet, post facto. After you violated the tumah in kodshim, then it tzitz is maratz b'di'evet. That's not what the Gemara means here. When we say tumah dechuya b'tzibur, and we have no other option but to bring the korban tzibur b'tumah, then tzitz maratza here in our Gemara is a lechatchila. We're allowed to bring the korban b'tumah. It's not that post facto you had the avera and now the tzitz comes, as the shining knight in shining armor. I'm going to give you a kapara for the avera that you committed. No, the tzitz ritzui is going to give us a din. It's going to produce a new din that lechatchila we're allowed to bring the korban tzibur b'tumah. And that's what he writes here. Aval b'korbanos tzibur amra Torah she'efshel lechatchila lakriva b'tumah. And that's the power of kapara that's generated by the tzitz, that lechatchila we're allowed to bring the korban b'tumah if it's a korban tzibur. Okay, now he has a kasha of Tosfos. That's the fourth Tosfos on the page. He says the heter to be makriv a korban b'tumah includes a case where the kohanim are tmeim, and they're allowed to be makriv even b'tumah. Later on Daf Pei, there's a mishnah that tzitz is not meratza al tumas haguf shel hamakrivim es hatum. So then the power of tzitz is limited based on this mishnah later on Daf Pei. And it doesn't apply or extend to the case of tumas haguf shel makrivim b'tumah. So this halach that we're learning, that a korban tzibur can be brought b'tumah, could not possibly be based on tzitz maratza, because tzitz is not maratza as far as the tumah of the kohanim hamakrivim. And we're talking about kohanim that are tmeim, and they're going to bring the korban tzibur, because we couldn't find any kohanim to do the job, so it's dechuya. But it's based on tzitz being meratza, but tzitz cannot be meratza al tumas kohanim hamakrivim, as I state in the Mishnah. So the Rambam in Bias Mikdash says that Mishnah, that the tzitz is not meratza on tumas haguf of the makrivim, that's only with regard to a korban yachid. But with regard to korban tzibur, the tzitz is meratza even on tumas haguf of the kohanim hamakrivim. Now, Rabbi Chanan Wasserman wants to answer the kasha of Tosfos, which seems like an impossible question to answer. He says, "Af shetumas haguf dechuya b'tzibur, af she'ein tzitz meratza, but tumas hakorban lo hoisa nidches b'tzibur im lo hoya hatzitz meratza." Very complicated, very abstract. He's saying that if not for the fact that tzitz is meratza, then this korban would be completely possible. So that even though tzitz doesn't have the power to be meratza on tumas haguf, but nevertheless, the korban itself is not going to be completely rejected, so to speak, but there's a tzitz meratza. Habir bazehu shekshenitma basar hakorban af shedochsa hatoras ha'isur lahakir b'tumah mikama konkevit lo hutra tumah el dechuyahi adayin hakorban ukorban pasuk. V'ena ol l'ratzon rak al yidei reach that tzitz. Aval tumas haguf yesh lomer she'ein psul begufo shel korban, but meshu karei b'tumas haguf. The fact that the Kohanim who do the hakrava are tmeim, that doesn't make the guf hakarban tamei. Elashe ksha carbon karev beisur who nifta. So the posel here is not because the carbon is posel, but because it was brought beisur. Lachen kisha isur lahaker b'tumah v'karev hakarban b'tumah. Hareu posel avak shenitcha isur lahaker b'tumah. Ena carbon nifsel v'meshu karev b'tumah. The af below ritzui tzitz. So he says that when the carbon itself is kosher, when there's only tumas kohanim and not tumas basar, then the problem with this carbon is, as far as ritzui is concerned, it's that it's being brought be'isa. But once we have halach of dechuya, whenever that halach of dechuya applies, there's no longer an isa nakrava, and hence, since the carbon begufo inherently is kosher, therefore it's ola l'rotz. Okay. Now, why do we assume that Tumah dechuya b'tzibur, kuli alma? The lekatana deshamet le the omar Tumah hucha b'tzibur el Rabbi Yehuda will add the word bilvad, meaning the only one of the Tanoim who waves the flag of Tumah hucha b'tzibur is Rabbi Yehuda. And the Gemara assumes that all the other Tanoim disagree and reject Rabbi Yehuda. They all hold a Tumah dechuya b'tzibur. That's a premise that the Gemara lays down without even trying to prove it. Now, the Gemara is going to quote a brisa to prove that Rabbi Yehuda holds Tumah hutra b'tzibur, and his opinion was rejected. I shouldn't say rejected, but in other words, the Chachamim disagreed with Rabbi Yehuda. Now, in this brisa, there's no quote of the Chacham. We have Rabbi Shimon. So this brisa records Machlokes Shin Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda. And the missing piece is, why did the Gemara assume that if Rabbi Shimon disagrees with Rabbi Yehuda, he's representing all the Chachamim? This is a unanimous decision to reject Rabbi Yehuda. That's unclear. Okay, now we talk about tzitz. We have machlokas here between Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda about when and how the tzitz is maratz. According to Rabbi Shimon, the tzitz is maratz, period. According to Rabbi Yehuda, the tzitz is going to be maratz only because it sets up the Kohen Gadol as wearing the tzitz. So therefore, Rabbi Shimon says, tzitz bein sheyeshnal mitzcho bein she'enal mitzcho maratza. Again, if the tzitz is broken, it's non-existent, then everybody agrees that there's no ritzu. Rabbi Shimon holds that as long as the tzitz is somewhere in the veld, and it's in one piece, then the tzitz itself inherently has the catalyst, the power to be maratz al adumah. And Reb Shimon is going to prove this, fascinating proof, because the Kohen Gadol on the holiest day of the year, when he enters into the holiest place on the face of the earth, the Kodesh Kadoshim, he's wearing 4 begadim out of 8, not including the tzitz. So you can imagine that Rabbi Shimon proved that the tzitz must be barata, even if it's not al mitzcho. There's a chovas gavra that the Kohen Gadol has to wear the tzitz, but that doesn't activate the tzitz. The tzitz has its own, its own power. What was the name of that movie that was very popular like 25 years ago, where he created some sort of like a golem, and the golem spoke and thought and so forth. What was it called? Do you remember that? Mr. E or Mr. T or something or other. Anyway, so that if the tzitz could talk, the tzitz would say, I am Maratza. I don't need the Kohen Gadol. And the proof is because there'll be Ritzi tzitz when the Kohen enters into the Kodesh Kodashim on Yom Kippurim and he's not wearing the tzitz. So says Rabbi Shimon, Hatzitz bein sheyesh al mitzcho, ubein she'eno al mitzcho Maratza. It's mechaper on the Korban Tumah. And it's Ol L'Rotz. Divrei Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Odenu al mitzcho Maratza. Eino deno al mitzcho, eino maratz. The tzitz could be in one shape and it's not broken, in perfect shape, but if it's not being worn by the Kohen, it's not activated. Hamalo Rabbi Shimon. Kohen gadol b'yom kippur yochia. He's not wearing his tzitz al metzach when he goes to do the avodah b'kodesh kodashim. She'eino al mitzcho. Umikol makom, and nevertheless, maratza. It's maratza on the korbanos that became tameh. At least at that moment, it may be korbanos that are tameh. Now, how does Reb Shimon know that the Kohen Gadol is not wearing his tzitz when he enters into the Kodesh Kodashim? That's because every day of the year he wears Shmona Begadim. He has the list here: the Shmona Begadim, the Ksones, the Mechasayim, the Mitznefes, the Avnei, the Choshen, the Ephod, the Me'il, and the Tzitz. That's called Big Day Zav. But on Yom Kippur, when he goes into the Kodesh Kodashim, the Torah says, Ksones Bad Kodesh Yilbash, Michnasei Bad Yiu Al Besoro, Ubi Avnei Bad Yachor, Ubi Mitznefes Bad Yitznov. So he wears 4 Begadim, which are called the Big Day Lavan, and he doesn't wear the tzitz. The Gemara says in Rosh Hashanah that the Kohen Gadol should not wear the tzitz into the Kodesh Kodashim because ein kateger nasa saneger, because the tzitz is made of gold, and that reminds us of the Egel Azah. Now Rabbi Shimon here holds that Tumah dechuya b'tzibur, and anything that you bring b'tumah, it's only ritzu, it's only meaningful because the tzitz is maratza. So therefore, from the fact that we're allowed to bring karbanos on Yom Kippurim, those karbanos tzibur that are b'tumah, it must be because the tzitz is maratza. But yet the Kohen Gadol is not wearing the tzitz; it's big day zav, which he cannot wear inside the Kodesh Kodashim. Hence, I must derive the conclusion that there's an inherent power in the tzitz to be maratza. That's Rabbi Shimon. Now, the Gemara says in Yuma that even Rabbi Shimon would agree that if the tzitz is broken, it's not maratza. The machlok shin Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon is only if the tzitz is chai v'kayam, but it's not being worn now on the forehead of the Kohen Gadol. Rabbi Shimon holds that from the fact that the Torah says v'hayal metzchot tamid, the word tamid, according to Rabbi Shimon, should be, in a sense, separated from the rest of the pasuk of v'hayal mitzcho. Forget about that. But tamid means that it's always maratza, whether it's al mitzcho or shelo al mitzcho. He is unwilling to accept that the pasuk is telling me that the tzitz always has to be on the forehead of the Kohen Gadol, 24/7, because the Kohen Gadol has to go to sleep, he has to go to the bathroom, pardon the expression. He's not going to be wearing the tzitz 24/7. So therefore, what do we do with the pasuk that says tamid? You read the pasuk literally, straightforward. It says he's always wearing the tzitz. That's not true. The reality contradicts this pasuk. It's impossible to assume that the Kohen Gadol is always wearing the tzitz. So therefore, Rabbi Shimon says there's no question about it that we have no choice, but the word tamid is not referring to wearing it tamid, but to be maratza. And that ritzui means it's as if he's wearing it. So even when he's not wearing it, it's like he's wearing it. Rabbi Yehuda, on the other hand, derives from this pasuk v'hayal metzach Aaron v'nasa. Right, that the v'nasa, which tells me the power of the tzitz to be maratza for tumah, that's only v'hayal metzach Aaron. The tzitz cannot be maratza unless at this moment the Kohen Gadol is wearing the tzitz on his metzach. Now, if a korban becomes tamei, here's a machlokes Rashi and the Ramah. Rashi says that everything depends upon the moment that it became tamei. Was the tzitz, according to Rabbi Yehuda, on the metzach of the Kohen Gadol at the moment that the tumah came into being? The Ramah says that it doesn't depend on the moment that the tumah came into being, but rather at the moment of the akravas korban b'tumah. Truth is that if you ask me, the Ramah is much more intuitive than Rashi. I mean, why do we care about the moment that it contracted tumah? That doesn't seem to be the critical moment. Okay. So now, what is Rabbi Yehuda's counter argument against Rabbi Shimon? Omar lo, hanach liyom kippurim, shetuma hutra b'tzibur. We said over and over again that if tumah is dechuya, then I need the tzitz. Says Rabbi Yehuda, but tumah is hutra, and if I don't need the tzitz, because the tzitz is coming to baratza on the avon of tumah, but there is no avon b'tumah when the korban is a korban tzibur, and we have tumah, then the Torah tells me to bring this korban. If the Torah is telling me to bring the korban, then it can't be an avon, it's hutra. I don't need the tzitz. So that when the Kohen Gadol enters into the Kodesh Kodashim on Yom Kippurim, at that moment, all the Korbanos Tzibur were brought on Yom Kippur, and that's called Hutra B'tumah. We don't need the Kohen Gadol and the Tzitz to be Maratz al Tumah, because there's no Avon Tumah. It's Hutra. And as we said before, the premise is that all the Tanoim disagreed with Rabbi Yehuda on this very point. Certainly we see it here in this price in the name of Rabbi Shimon. So let's ask a dumb question. According to Rabbi Yehuda, if Tumah is Hutra B'tzibur and I don't need the tzitz, so why do I need the tzitz? And the answer is for a Korban Yachid, because a Korban Yachid, we said before, even if I hold that Tumah Hutra B'tzibur, that's only for a Korban Tzibbur. But in the case of a Korban Yachid, Kuliyam lo pligi, that Tumah is Dechuya B'tzibur, which means that when the Yachid is bringing his Korban B'tumah, there's an Avera here. You bring a Korban B'tumah, that's not acceptable. The answer is that the tzitz comes to be maratza on this Korban Yachid B'tumah. The Gemara says, Michlal, to Rabbi Shimon Savar, Tumah Dechuya Hi B'tzibur. In other words, Rabbi Shimon, who says that we derive from Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippurim that the tzitz is maratza even if he's not wearing the tzitz, meaning that we need a ritzui tzitz. And therefore, Rabbi Shimon asks, where's the ritzui tzitz if the Kohen is not wearing the tzitz? He's only wearing Big Day Lavan. He doesn't have a tzitz. That question of Rabbi Shimon, which forced Rabbi Shimon to conclude a far-reaching revolutionary conclusion that the tzitz is maratza in and of itself, even if it's not being worn in the Kohen Gadol, proved that Rabbi Shimon held that Tumah is Dechuya B'tzibur. Because if you would hold Tumah is Hutra B'tzibur, then we're back to Rabbi Yehuda, And we don't need the tzitz if you hold hutra. By studies, we must conclude that Rabbi Shimon holds Tumah dechuya b'tzibur, and therefore can only be meaningful and valid if there's a ritzi tzitz. Now comes the question of Rabbi Shimon. The Kohen Gadol is not wearing the tzitz when he goes in lifnai v'lifnim. How could there be a ritzi tzitz if he's not wearing the tzitz? The answer is the tzitz in and of itself is marat. Now, are there any korbanos on Yom Kippurim where you would say that tzitz is maratza, even according to Rabbi Yehuda, who holds a Tumah hutra b'tzibur? And that we said was a korban yachid. Are there any korbanos yachid on Yom Kippurim? Guess what? There are. I didn't even know this. There's what's called paro shel kohen gadol. All the korbanos of Yom Kippurim come from the tzibur, meaning the money is collected and it's put in the lishkas, in the Trumas Halishka, and for the kohen, on behalf, for the tzibur, on behalf of the tzibur. So it's by the tzibur and for the tzibur, except for par lechatos ayali ola shel kohen gadol, which had to be purchased from the Kohen Gadol's own personal bank account. So that's par lechatos and ayali ola. And all this is in Parshas Achrei Mos. It says there, "B'zos yovo Aaron el hakodesh, v'par ben bakar lechatos v'ayoli ola." That's Aaron. That's the Kohen Gadol. He brings his own personal par lechatos and ayol liol. Now, at the moment that he brings these karbanos, the korban yachid of the Kohen Gadol himself, it's mishalo, it's his own personal korban. He's wearing now shmona begad, which means big day zav. One of the 8 is the tzitz. So therefore, the tzitz could be maratza. Again, if you're talking about those karbanos that he brings on behalf of the tzibur when he's wearing only big day love and he's not wearing the tzitz, those don't need ritzi tzitz, because even if there's tumah there, it's a hutra tzibur situation according to Rabbi Yehuda. But when it comes to the Kohen Gadol's own personal par and ayil, here if there's tumah, we need ritzi tzitz. But in fact, when he does that avoda, it's the avoda aschutz, where he's wearing shmona begad, like he does the rest of the year, including the tzitz. Now, we've established, again, I'm not sure why the Gemara assumes that Rabbi Shimon represents all of the Tanoim. That I don't know. But Tumah dechuya b'tzibur. That's premise number 1. Now we get to premise number 2. Kuli alma, everybody agrees. Ein hatzitz maratza al achilos. In other words, as far as the kaparas hakorban is concerned, and it was bituma, the tzitz is maratz. So, for example, the zrikas hadam on the mizbeach, or in the case of menachos, where we have something called kmitza, and that's the parallel to dam in zvachim, to zrikas hadam in zvachim, is everybody agrees that einat tzitz maratza al ha'achilos. Achilos means that part of the korban that's necha. Why? Because tzitz is only maratza on the zrikas hadam or the kmitza in menachos. The leka tana deshameloi the omar. We never heard from any tana shat tzitz maratza al achilos ella Rabbi Eliezer bilvad. And once again, the Gemara identifies a das yochid, which I don't understand how the Gemara knows this, but it's only Rabbi Eliezer who expands the scope of tzitz maratza. The power of tzitz to be maratza applies even to achilos. The Sanya Rabbi Eliezer Omer Atzitz Maratza al Hachilos. Rabbi Yossi Omer Ein Atzitz Maratza al Hachilos. And apparently we all accepted, all the Tanoim accepted the view of Rabbi Yossi. Now, you may recall a Gemara in Eruvin that says that Rabbi Yossi, whenever he argues with one Tana, halacha kamosa, we always accept his view. So when the Gemara says kuli alma, it means la halacha. It doesn't mean kuli alma that all the Tanoim got together, they took a vote, and they all came to the conclusion that einat sitz maratza ala achilos. That's not so. But we pass like Rabbi Yossi when he argues against another Tana. Now, what does it mean when we say that einat sitz maratza al hachilos? He says, "Anidon imatzitz maratza al hachilos eno le'inyan she'muto lechol asabosar b'tumah shezev vade ein ritzui tzitz bo lahati asabosar es b'sara korban machilo shelo hutra achilas korban tamei ela korban pesach bilvad." So that's a Mishnah that we already touched upon. Hanidon hu ha'imat tzitz maratza ala basar sheichoshev ki'ilu lo nitma. So again, to be matir achilas basar betuma, that for sure is not mutter, except for the case of Korban Pesach. But would the tzitz be maratz on the basar to consider it as if it was not tameh? Le'inyan sheyuchal lizrok es hadam. Okay, so we're going with the shita that im ein basar ein dam, which we're about to learn Rav Yeshua. So the question is, can we be zorek the dam if the zevach, the basar zevach is tameh, and we paskin now like Rabbi Yossi that the tzitz is not going to help us. It's not going to be maratza al ha'achilos. So again, let's just summarize. We now are of the opinion that everybody agrees, and we're rejecting Rabbi Yehuda, that Tumah dechuya b'tzibur. We're also holding that since Tumah is dechuya b'tzibur, the only way we can be makav b'tumah is to reach tzitz, and tzitz is not maratz ala ochlu. Those are the three major premises. Let's go over them one more time. Tumah dechuya b'tzibur. Therefore, we need reach tzitz, and therefore it's not maratz ala ochlu. So the Gemara says, "Nema masnisin to lo to Rabbi Yehuda, to Rabbi Yeshua," that we cannot accept Rabbi Yeshua in our Mishnah. And why is that? I mean, the Gemara is gonna go through somersaults here until we get up to that. I just want to see. Just 1 second. If you can give me a second here, this is good. I think it'll make life a little bit easier for us. Where is it? 1 second. Oh, Gemara is going to say on Daf Ayin Zayin Amid Beis, came on the Omer since Rabbi Yeshua says that you need both the dam and the basar in order to allow zrikas habasar. And now, in order to be mekayim hakrovas korban tzibbur b'tumah, we need ritzit tzitz because we're holding tumah d'chuya. V'tzitz achilos lo meratze, and we're accepting Rabbi Yosef that tzitz is not meratze al tumos. Is hechi osi b'tumah. How could we bring all the korbanos that I mentioned in our Mishnah b'tumah? Kevon shenitma b'saram. Kevon shenitma b'saram. Those are the key words. If I could figure those key words out, we're in good shape. Because then I think all the pieces of the puzzle will fit into place. Kevon shenitma habasar. Not sure. How does the Gemara know that nitma habasar? Maybe we're talking about Tumas Kohanim. That's one premise that I have to clarify. It was clear to the Gemara that our Mishnah that allows Korban Tzibbur b'tumah is talking about nitma habasar. And that can't work out according to Rabbi Yeshua because Rabbi Yeshua holds im ein basar ein dam. And since Tumah d'chuya b'tzibur, we need the tzitz to be meratz, and the tzitz can't be meratz ala ochlin on the basar. So the Gemara says, Nema masnisin delok Rabbi Yeshua, because it means that according to Rabbi Yeshua, if the basar became tameh or it gets lost, you cannot be zorik the dam. And where do we learn Rabbi Yeshua? The Sanya we learned in a brisa, the Torah says, "V'yasisa olosecha habasar v'adam." So in the parish of Korban Ola, it says habasar v'adam. That phrase habasar v'adam indicates that they're together. It's like one entity, one unit of basar and dam. Is Rabbi Yeshua Omer, from the fact that it says habasar ve'adam, it means that the zrikas adam must be dependent upon the basar because it says habasar ve'adam. And therefore, Rabbi Yeshua derives the conclusion, Shem ein dam is ein basar. So let's say the dam is lost. And the flip side is, in ein basar, if the basar is not roy lachila or lakrova, depending upon whether you talk about the imurim or the part that's nechal, is ein zarkinis adam. And Rabbi Eliezer Omer, no. Dam, we could be zorik the dam, afal pichein basar. And l'chora, we're going to have to ask the question, according to Rabbi Eliezer, what do we do with the pasuk basar ve'adam, which seems to equate the two? But in any event, Rabbi Eliezer has another pasuk. Actually, it's the same pasuk. Shenemar, it says, "V'dam zvachecha yishafech al mizbach Hashem." Now, the pasuk seems to indicate that "V'dam zvachecha yishafech," as we just spoke about habasar, and now the Torah is saying "Dam zvachecha yishafech." What is the Torah adding over here? It is cutting off the dependence on the dam. No, I'm sorry. it's cutting off the dependence on the basar because it says v'dam zvachecha yichafek. So there's zrikas adam even without basar. So you don't have dam the basar that's roy, but we'll go ahead and we zorik the dam. Umani makayim. What do I do with the pasuk? Oh, good. Our question. Rabbi Yeshua had quoted the pasuk Sisal Asecha Basar Vadam, mashma that they form one unit, one whole. He says, Lo melacha ma dam bizrika, af basar bizrika. V'yomer shalul katan yesh ben hakevesh lemizbeh. So the way that the avarim are brought onto the mizbeach has to be similar to zrika. What makes it similar to zrika? They have a gap of empty space between the ramp and the mizbeach, so that when the Kohen puts the avarim on the top of the mizbeach, on the eish of the maracha, he's standing on the keves. And if he's standing on the keves, he does a kind of zrika of the avarim onto the eish of the mizbeach. But we should not accept the equation of habasar adam. It's not an equation. It's only telling you how you get the basar onto the mizbeach. In the same kind of pu'ula, the same kind of zrika that you'd get the dam onto the mizbeach. But there's no equation here indicating that dam and basar are integrated to form one unit. That's Rabbi Yeshua's take on this pasuk about basar adam. And therefore, ain basar, ain dam. So the Gemara asks Rabbi Yeshua, Nami Oksiv Dam Svachecha Yishafek, which machma the dam is independent of basar. Omalacha Haksiv Gabev HaBasar Tochel. So even when it says V'dam Svachecha Yishafek, that's only VaBasar Tochel, when the basar could be eaten. It's Roy Lachil. So once again, it means basar ain't dam. And here we're up to Daf Ayin Zayin Amud Beis, and the Gemara has a kasha on Rabbi Yeshua. Hani trei kroi lomali. Why do I need two drushos in order to derive the conclusion that we're not zorik the dam unless the basar is roy lachila? You have number one, the pasuk about basar vadam, and number two, you have the pasuk v'dam tvachecha yishafech v'basar tocha. Why do I need both psukim? And now the Gemara is going to enter into a whole long discussion, which I think we'll leave for tomorrow, about the difference between ola and shlamim. That in the case of ola, we understand that the Zrikas Adam and the Haktoras Habasar are part of one whole, one entity. Because there's no achila of the basar. It's all Haktor al Gabi H HaMizbeach. In Shlamim, we would have a hava, meaning that maybe we could separate the dam from the basar because the basar is a separate, independent entity. It's basal achila. It's not put on the mizbeach. So in the case of ola, I understand that dam and basar form one unit, and it's habatalia. They're interdependent because they both go on the mizbeach. But in the case of shlamim, where the basar is not going on to the mizbeach, I would assume that basar and dam are two separate entities, and therefore I need a pasuk for both of them. Then the Gemara is as far to say that maybe in shlamim that it has two achilos, right? There's achilas mizbeach and there's achilas bailim. That's where the Torah would say im ein basar ein dam. But ola doesn't have two achilos. Ema we would argue low. There's no din of ein basar below, ein dam below basar. So this is a very difficult piece of Gemara that we have to pick up tomorrow. Shtei achilos. Okay, so there are two achilos. So therefore what? Therefore the dam stands independent of two achilos. And we need a special pasuk, because if not for special pasuk, then the halach of ein dam below basar would not apply. What do you mean ein dam below basar doesn't apply because there are two achilos? Very strange. Okay, so we'll stop here. I mean, we're really in the thick of the sugya, so we'll have to have a little bit of a review, to highlight the summary of the sugya of Rabbi Lazar and Rabbi Yeshua in order to continue in the sugya. But I couldn't fit it all into one shir. It's not shy. I mean, the Gemara keeps going on and on. Okay, then. So have a great day. And just